Hello, everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today, once again, we say hello to Mike Amundsen. Hey, Mike, how are you doing?
Doing great. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So today we'll talk about API landscapes and how to share information across API landscapes. So we see APIs are growing in scale and mass in organizations, and we see those landscapes becoming pretty complex. And how you can share information across APIs, I think that is something that is a little bit, I would say, API governance, maybe. And there are certain problems, right, that probably happen over and over. Could you give us maybe an example that you've seen in practice?
Yeah. So this idea of sharing values or sharing understanding across API, like across a landscape, as you say, is actually, I think, a pretty common situation. I mean, you can think, for example, of maybe you're doing some order processing. You got several components, several services, microservices or whatever. Some are managing the initial order, some are tracking the order through its life cycle, maybe some are archiving, so on and so forth. So you may have like an order state, like pending and working or closed or active or shipping or whatever. And those values, those actual values, they need to be shared across lots of different components. So it may not always make sense for just one API to own all those details. It's something that lots of people share. So I think that's an example, right?
Yeah, I think it's a good example because, like you say, there probably will be several services, several capabilities that work with orders. And of
Yeah.
course, we want all of them to have a shared understanding of an order state. And we maybe don't want, like you said, to kind of bury that in just one API. And we also may want to change that list, right? That's also a possible thing that could happen, I guess.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, over time, you may add states to the value, but that means you're going to need to think about how you design your API, right? You might have to update the specification. That might be some disruption. There's another issue there, right?
Yeah, I think that's the interesting part there. If you say the order space or the order state space can evolve, I think then you just need to make the usual promises that we talk about a lot, right, in API design. That ideally you don't want to have breaking changes. What does it mean? Well, I don't change the meaning of existing things. I don't take things away. And if I add things, I only add them where I can kind of legitimately add them, right? And I
Right.
think the same thing would apply here.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely true. Now, that also means some values, maybe not order state, but some other values might be a lot more dynamic. That list or that set of values might change pretty frequently, and that means changing the specification fairly frequently. Even if you do it in a, backward compatible way, that could be pretty disruptive. There are got to be other ways to think about this, right?
I think that's the beauty of this idea a little bit, that you can decouple certain things from your specific API design, right? Where you can say, I'm designing an API that talks about orders, but the states of orders are not part of the API. It's kind of it's by reference, so to speak, right? It's managed someplace else, and the order API says whatever the current states are, expect those, and they may evolve, like you say, they may evolve over time. And if they do, I don't have to update the API, right? That's kind of I think that's really the neat little thing here.
So that's a pretty useful pattern. I don't see that pattern very often. I see it sometimes in APIs, but I mean, can you talk more about what that pattern is and what that looks like in real life, maybe?
It's true that I don't see it much or at all either, and I'm sometimes a little bit confused by that. I have to admit, because I think there are there are interesting ways in which you could use that. But I think in part it's also because then the question is, well, how do I now treat or how do I manage that list?
Yeah.
Right? Do I have it in some shared Word document? Hopefully not. Do I have it like where do I keep this list so that if somebody wants to find out what the permissive values are at the moment, where can I find them, right? And how do I update that thing? And I think that's a pattern that, like you say, is useful. but that we don't really see that much. But we've seen it in kind of a different space a lot, right?
Right, right. So this is actually a pretty common pattern for the IETF space, right? That's a huge landscape with lots of people that need to share information, and they call that a registry, right?
Yeah, like you say, it's a huge landscape, and they are pretty good at managing things over time. So I think they have proven that they know how to do that.
Yep.
And yeah, they have registries, right? And that's the interesting thing, right? They have hundreds and hundreds of registries that manage those value spaces where the specification says if something changes, then we don't have to changes in the specification. Instead, we just add a new value to the registry. And there's a process for that. And there's a place
Yep.
where you can go. The IANA page, we link it from the description, right? And then you look those things up. And they reuse this infrastructure and this design pattern over and over again. And I think it's a very smart thing to do. And it's a very efficient way how you can balance those parts that evolve, like little
Yep.
bits and pieces where you say this thing may see new values, but the rest actually stays the same.
Yeah, and that definitely starts to change the way you think about writing your specification, right? So just to focus on the IANA and the HTTP space or the HTML space, for example, some HTML link relation values used to be in the HTML specification, and now they're kept in a registry. Recently, changes to the HTTP spec are moving things like the actual definitions for methods and other things into registries as well, right? So the registry becomes a pretty powerful pattern that allows you to extend over time without actually changing the baseline spec, right?
Yeah, I think it is a really good pattern. It's always, I would say, and there are always discussions in the IETF working groups when somebody says, well, this should be a registry, or somebody says, no, we don't want this to be a registry, right? Because it's always this discussion, like how dynamic do we want this specific value, so to speak, to be? But it's a really interesting and useful discussion to have. And that's why I think it would be interesting to at least explore this pattern a little bit more in the API space. But like you
Yep.
said, we don't really see it much or at
Yeah, I mean,
all. Yeah.
I would love if viewers would say, "Oh, no, we use it all the time. Here's a great example." I'd love to get more of it. And doing this sort of registry notion, this separating out some, more dynamic parts, doesn't need to be really heavy-handed or complicated. You could literally use a GitHub page, right, that lists all of the possible, say, order states that can be applied. You can almost treat it like these are just value objects or a list of values that you could sort of reuse over time. So there's definitely you can get started relatively easily, but it also means you have to start making some additional promises or changes to your design, doesn't it?
Yeah, you need to have processes how you update the registry. You need to make promises, so to speak, for values in the registry, right? Where you say we don't just change the meaning of a value or we don't remove a value, right? If we don't want this to be used anymore, we mark it as don't use this anymore, but we
Right,
don't just
obsolete or
delete it.
something. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that, right? So yeah, there are. I think it's very easy to do, and the machinery actually that you see in the IETF is, I think, it's relatively simple, and by far the most effort is in the process and not in the machinery.
Yeah, I think speaking of process, there's another aspect to this too. So we talk a lot about don't don't take things away, don't change the meaning. That's sort of the producer side of these registries or any API specification. But you also have to kind of help the consumer. You have to give the consumer some understanding or some advice as well, right? I think you call it a processing model for the input list or the API, right?
Yes, it needs to be part of the design where in the API you would say, here we use a value from this registry, right? And if you look up the registry now, you'll see, okay, there are 5 values. But you also need to understand that tomorrow there may be 7 values. And then you need to write your client so that if it encounters one of the two new values, that it does something reasonable. At least it shouldn't
Right.
just crash and burn. Maybe it should just stop at this point and say, hey, there's a new value. I know this is okay, but I don't know what to do. Or maybe, if it, let's say, if we go back to the example for orders, right? If you say, well, if I'm just counting orders, or I'm just creating kind of a log, right, then I just print that value. I don't need to know
Yep.
what it means. I just
Yep.
accept that there is a new one. And I think these are like these beauties of this design, right? You can play with how things change and how everybody adapts to those changes and pulls them in as they appear.
Yeah, so I think that's another thing to think about. I might need to ignore it and just move on. I might need to stop and register
Yeah,
the
just
change and alert somebody.
yes.
I may need to actually say, well, if I get this, then I'll just pretend it's like that. The default to something. But you have to work that out, and that's another part of the design. So I think this turns out to be a pretty rich and powerful pattern, this
It
registry
is.
pattern to extend your API, keep parts stable, and also support extensions as well. I think that's pretty cool.
I think it's nice. And a little while ago, I wrote a whole draft on kind of how to use
Right?
registries, because I just
Yeah,
like this pattern.
I love it.
And it occurred to me that actually for the API space, that could be interesting as well. And like you said, I also would like to ask our viewers, right? If you're using that, let us know, please, for what, and also how you're managing those registries, because I think it's interesting. There may be something in there also for, well, maybe that becomes a new practice that you
Yeah,
can use in your API landscape, and that where we can share some tooling.
exactly.
Okay, so I think that's a good wrap up. So it's a useful pattern. It's something we don't see much, but if you are in charge of API programs, if you build an API platform, if you're in charge of API governance, think about it. Maybe that's an interesting little facet that you could add to your tool set, to your repertoire of how you manage large API landscapes. Thanks, Mike, for joining.
You
As
bet.
usual, a really interesting conversation. And thanks, everybody, for joining. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing. And with that, we're done for today. Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.